Profititis. So, diagnosing and curing profititis sounds like a pretty, bold promise or, an interesting and challenging endeavor. Talk to us a little bit more about some of the profit killers that you help CEOs, executives, leaders identify and eliminate.
What on earth could we do, or what was part of that profit prescription, or what are some of the toolkits? Well, probably the first and biggest is just a profit psychology of shifting mindset from grow, revenue, to a greater share of your focus around bottom line profitability. I work with a lot of companies in different spaces, staffing and recruiting, construction, general businesses, B2B. And what I find is that the business press is so laser focused on what's going on in Silicon Valley.
Most civil engineering firms can be more profitable than they are. Today, I'm joined by Ben Hansen, a 5-time Inc. 5000 entrepreneur and founder of Profit Doctor. Ben's going to talk about a condition he calls profititis, when top-line growth hides serious bottom-line issues. And he's going to talk about how civil engineering companies can actually become more profitable by doing some very simple things. If you are leading or growing a firm, this is an episode that you're not going to want to miss. Now, before we jump in, I just want to tell you quickly about our AEC PM Connect event designed for firm leaders who want to elevate project delivery, build strong teams, and scale with confidence. These events provide an avenue to connect with other project delivery leaders in the industry. Visit aecpmconnect.com and get registered today. We currently have events in Kansas City and New Jersey, with more coming soon. Again, that's aecpmconnect.com. I'm your host, Anthony Fasano, and this is the Civil Engineering CEO. All right, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. We have with us today the Profit Doctor, Ben Hansen. Ben helps mid-sized firms become more profitable, and he's going to talk to us about that today. Ben, welcome on to the Civil Engineering CEO.
Absolutely, Anthony. I'm so glad to be here. Man, I love working with folks in the construction field. I often find that they can just be sponges for some of the things I talk about in terms of improving profitability. So I'm really eager to get started with you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So maybe just to get us going here, Ben, you can tell us a little bit about kind of yourself, Profit Doctor. Talk to us a little bit about kind of what you do, generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of joke because the business is called Profit Doctor. We kind of use a little bit of medical jargon. I call it profititis. And profititis is when companies have a pretty strong revenue base, but it is not showing when it comes to net profitability, owner distributions, and cash flow. And so what I try to do is to help people maybe shift a chunk of their focus from top line to bottom line, and trying to, we'll just say, optimize more for profitability rather than just thinking, 110, 150% on top line growth.
That's really interesting. And, in the kind of civil infrastructure space, especially over the past few years, there's been kind of a lot of private equity firms that have come in and have acquired a lot of civil infrastructure consulting firms because of the infrastructure funding and everything is going on. So I would say that there's been even more of a spotlight on profits in the last, few years. So that's something that we can kind of dig into a little bit. So, but that's interesting, the term profititis. So, diagnosing and curing profititis sounds like a pretty, bold promise or, an interesting and challenging endeavor. Talk to us a little bit more about some of the profit killers that you help CEOs, executives, leaders identify and eliminate.
Yeah, I'd actually like to cover two things. One, just a little bit about private equity, and then the kind of direct answer to your question. Often companies who have not been purchased by private equity, what I help them do is almost apply some of that private equity playbook. There's different parts to the playbook. One part is the roll up. Another part is a different kind of capital stack or the ability to really fund growth. But very commonly, one of the things that private equity companies will do when they buy a company is they sift through what they've got, identifying, hey, these are great assets or great things that are going on with the company. And here are, let's say, lousy elements of the company. Let's most likely dump the lousy non-performing elements of the company and then double down on the high-performing elements. And that is a lot, actually, of the profit prescription that I do, which is applying some of that private equity playbook to mid-sized companies, whether it's in advance of a sale or acquisition, or if you're just going to hold the company for a while, why not cash flow more? So the other part of your question was, what on earth could we do, or what was part of that profit prescription, or what are some of the toolkits? Well, probably the first and biggest is just a profit psychology of shifting mindset from grow, revenue to a greater share of your focus around bottom line profitability. I work with a lot of companies in different spaces, staffing and recruiting, construction, general businesses, B2B. And what I find is that the business press is so laser focused on what's going on in Silicon Valley, unicorns and software as a service and VC-backed companies. They're talking about a playbook, and let's just call it hockey, right? And the hockey playbook for SaaS companies in Silicon Valley is how to spend as much money as possible to grow as fast as possible with no real desire to drive bottom line profitability, to scale, to be first past the post and sort of win in that space. Well, that might work if you're one of those companies, but does that really have anything to do with a $100 million civil engineering company? I would hypothesize that it probably doesn't. So in that metaphor, why would you be using a hockey playbook if you're playing basketball? And so what I try to invite people to do is, let's get real about what sport you're playing, right? And for most regular kind of companies that are not software as a service, not infinite access to Kleiner Perkins capital in the Valley, bottom line profitability and cash flow is really darn important. And so let's make sure you're using the right playbook for that. So it starts with the psychology, and then probably the next biggest tool, which we'll probably talk about a little bit more, is stop doing what isn't working. And we can get into that even more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this concept in general is such an important concept for business owners, leaders to think about. The profititis, meaning, you could have a $2 million revenue company that could have less profit than a $1 million revenue company, right? It just depends on the company, depends on how you're running it. To Ben's point, if you're really focused on the top line revenue, there could be a lot of wasteful spending going on or other things happening within the business. So I think it's a really good thing to step back and think about. So that being said, Ben, let's dive a little bit more. So I know that you've helped companies improve margins, cash, and distributions pretty quickly. What are the core principles behind your 5 points of profit framework? Talk about that a little bit, because I know that that's a part of the solution.
Yeah. Let me just step through maybe a 4-part framework right here that might be just a little bit more simple. And probably as a baseline, one of the things I see very, very often in the construction space is that the people who are CEOs and founders of these companies didn't come to it with a background at Wharton Business School and a long management track at General Motors, right, or General Electric. Oftentimes they will say, came up as a civil engineer, did really good, and now they've got a team of 100 people or 1,000 people. And so for many of these folks, the math, the business side of it is a little bit of a secondary language. So the first thing we talked about, profit psychology, very, very important. Switching gears from just getting the business to getting good business instead of just growing to getting profitable business. The next step is what I call less worst, which means stop doing the things that are not working. And one of the ways that we improve profitability and cash flow so quickly is by cutting the worst performing elements of the business. And there's a variety of areas, everything from bad projects, which we could talk about in a little bit, to bad customers, possibly bad staff, bad market segments, sometimes bad subcontractors or suppliers. And so it often takes a fair amount of time to add more of something but it can be quite a bit faster to cut really low performing elements of things. So that's kind of step one, which is the profit psychology. Step two, less worst. Step three is what I sometimes refer to as the profit CFO, which is to really simplify and streamline financials and financial reports, and to kind of up level the financial literacy of some of the people in those executive management teams. Because sometimes people who came up through, let's just say, hanging drywall, and now they own a company that's doing $30 million of drywall, are not super familiar with P&L, cash flow statement, and balance sheet. And so we've got to simplify those and then just up level a little bit how to look at those so that we're getting the right data and the right information to the right people. And then pretty much the fourth step is what I call profit growth, which is instead of just trying to do more of everything, to do more of the best, or to double down in your sweet spots. And part of how this framework really ties together is that when you do less of the worst things, you save a lot of money and a lot of time, particularly time for the management team. And that allows you to take that, recouped set of resources, time and money, and ideally put some of the money back into your bank account or bottom line or, 401k or whatever. And part of that time to you and maybe your family and vacations and, taking a nap that you haven't taken in 3 years. But then you can also take the other chunk of that and then reapply that to that fourth step, which is doubling down on sweet spots.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that framework is very applicable to civil engineering because, number one, there are a lot of areas where you could do less worst, meaning you've got clients, like, for example, a lot of companies may do a lot of private sector work, and then they say, oh, wow, government jobs are good. They're big, and they get tangled up in the government work, but they don't understand how to do those proposals. They don't know how to run those contracts. They don't realize that government to pay you could take a lot longer, right, in terms of cash flow. And they get kind of off the beaten path in terms of what they do really good, and they get in a lot of trouble. Another example, I think, related to what you talked about around financial literacy, I also think is very important. We do a lot of project management training at EMI, and basically with civil engineering companies, your service is projects. You're delivering projects. So if you deliver your projects and they're not profitable, your company's not going to be profitable. And who's responsible for your projects? Project managers, who are engineers or architects that went to school for engineering and architecture, not for the financial side of your projects. So if you can educate your project managers more on the financial aspects of projects and running their financial reports for their projects to make sure that there's no overages or variances, that's going to be a really, really important part of improving your profits in a civil engineering company. So it sounds like the profit framework really lines up well with civil engineering companies because a lot of times they do a lot of the worst stuff, and they have project managers that just don't know how to read a finance report, but they're responsible for it because they're the PM for the projects.
Absolutely. I would imagine that a lot of civil engineers and civil engineering companies are very, very effective at optimizing certain kinds of things. But one area when it comes to profitability, of course, is you want to optimize the cost effectiveness of delivering a project. And so what we see a lot of times with companies that would be in the category that I would say is below average profitability is that there's a disconnect between bidding projects, doing projects, and some type of post-mortem where afterwards you figure out what went on to try to replicate the wins and not redo the losses. Very, very common where a project might be 80% of the way through the hours that have been bid, but maybe 30, 40, 50% of the way through the work, or thinking you're 100% of the way through the work when you've used up all your time. But then there's a lot of like punch list type items or cleanup and so forth. And so frequently then you're behind, 20% on your cost efficacy of actually delivering that. So we sometimes call that Operation Dog Catcher, which is how do you catch those projects that are going to be dogs before they happen. And that either means not bidding on them at all, if it's a kind of work or a kind of customer where you're not going to be successful, or using that post-mortem approach to figure out what lessons need to be learned to apply on the front end so you can fix something before it goes astray.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that as a civil engineering firm, one of the things that I would probably recommend you spend time on based on kind of what Ben has shared with us so far is going through your different project types and understanding which projects are more profitable, right? Like a roadway project of a certain budget may be a lot more profitable for you than doing like a residential subdivision, right? Or a different type of project. And if you can kind of think about the worst versus the best, you can get a feel for, hey, we've got to do more roadway projects, or we've got to do more certain types of projects because traditionally they have a much higher profit margin than the other projects. And that could go back to what you spoke about, Ben, in terms of getting your time back from those non-profitable projects and trying to invest them into more of the right kinds of projects.
Anthony, you are like right on the money there. So common that not 100% of your projects are equally effective in terms of profitability. Not 100% of your customer types are equally effective. And so you mentioned, roadways versus residential developments. And then previously you mentioned like government work versus not. I mean, I bet that thing with government work is a big albatross around many people's necks. From my way of thinking, only a handful of companies are really, really suited to crush it in, the state and federal type space. And then a lot of other people get kind of lured into those big numbers and keep kind of chasing those projects with little to show for it. So I kind of apply a twist on the 80-20 rule. Many of you are probably familiar with the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, which says that, 80% of the goodness of most things is coming from the top 20% of performers. So, very commonly an example is your top 20% of customers are delivering 80% of your revenue. What I like to do is flip that rule upside down and think to yourself, if you're getting 80% of the goodness from 20% of the top stuff, what on earth is going on with 20% of the bottom stuff? And generally the answer is almost nothing positive. And so I have a rule or a principle that I call the 50-20 principle. And the idea there is to cut half of the worst 20% in the next 30 days. And so let's just use an example of team members, okay? So if you have 20 employees or 100 employees or 1,000 employees, it's highly likely that the bottom 20% of those employees are not especially effective. In fact, in the Gallup Global Workplace Study, where they have been doing for years and years, polling something like 150,000 significant divisions or entire companies around the world, they have established that roughly 18% of employees around the world are actively disengaged. I'll put another synonym there, which might be toxic. You can insert your own synonym for what actively disengaged means. But we'll just say that the 80-20 principle is in effect when it comes to staff. The top 20%, superstars, that big bulk in the middle, 60%, average, good, maybe a little below average, and then the bottom 20%, particularly not very good. Now, if we were to look at that bottom 20%, very often there are some examples that it's really hard to step away from quickly. But then there's a big chunk that's pretty easy to step away from quickly. And so that's why the 50-20 rule doesn't say cut everything from the bottom right away. It just says, let's just cut half of that bottom 20%. And that can be very, very effectively applied to the types of products or services that you're applying, the particular customers you're working with, the market segments you're working with, folks on, your employees and subcontractors, sometimes vendors. So really think almost any large element of your business, it's highly likely that there's a superstar 20% and a super fill in the blank word for the bottom 20%. And what I find is that across the 5 or 6 usual suspects in those categories, most companies are going to be really darn good at only having mid and top performers in that one area. But it's incredibly rare that they're equally as good across all of those 5 or 6 categories that I talked about.
That's great. And I like that because it's like we talked about earlier, it could be like kind of a fast way to get you on the right track.
Yep.
Doesn't take a lot of thinking. It's easy to, frame out.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
You talked about, that bottom 20%, you use the example of, your staff. It could be, a number of things, the project types. But when you talk about performance, right? Because I think that underperforming can definitely be a reason for, lack of profitability as one potential option. So I know you have an approach you call raise the bar that helps
Yep.
leaders identify and address underperformance. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So raise the bar and the 50-20 rule, really go hand in hand. The 50-20 principle, which I just described, kind of gives you a framework of what to do, when to do it, maybe how deeply to cut. And then the raise the bar, we have a series of templates in my Profit Accelerator program where I coach people over a period of 90 days to get another 5 points of profitability. Now that, your mileage may vary because different industries are different, but generally speaking, a business that's primarily in the services industry can often, and you're in below average profitability territory for your industry, 75 to 80% of the time, we do get 5 additional points of top line revenue flowing to the bottom line net profitability within 90 days. So it can be very powerful. So how do we do that? The raise the bar approach that I mentioned. And the way that we do that is we evaluate, and let's just take subcontractors as an example, maybe a little bit less emotionally charged than staff. If we look at those subcontractors and we evaluate them by contribution to the business, high, medium, and low, and then we evaluate them, joy to manage or alignment to our values, high, medium, and low, invariably there will be roughly 20% in the low intersection of those two criteria. And that is prime hunting space or fertile ground for reduction in those bottom performers. And one of the things I just alluded to in the beginning is this idea that when you do less of the worst stuff, it frees up a lot of time and it frees up a lot of money. And then the question is, what do you do with that? So think to yourself, how much time are you spending with your problem children trying to address that versus doubling down on your brightest stars? My old company had 100 employees, and I'll tell you, as a management team, we spent an inordinate amount of time dealing with the problem children, much, much more than thinking, how can we all collectively do our Monday morning meeting to brainstorm on how to make our 3 best sales reps sell more stuff this week? It was usually, how do we deal with this HR issue that, somebody is thinking about a lawsuit or we have a problem with a client or something like that. And so there is so much benefit in doing that less worst because it gives you back time, headspace, joy, kind of like emotional grounding to work on doubling down on your best stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I've noticed that even with our business at EMI is as your business grows and you're in business for a long time, there are just things that you keep doing because you've always been doing them, right?
Yeah,
but they're not necessarily profitable anymore. They're not the best use of your time and energy. So I think the idea of kind of doing this audit from time to time where you're looking at the, what's the best, what's the worst, how can we do, focus our energy in the right way is important because we just get into these habits and these routines and we keep doing. We just did something here recently where we put out a lot of content at EMI. We have about 10 podcasts and some different YouTube channels. So I just said to our team, like, we shouldn't just be doing a podcast stream to do a podcast stream, right? Let's take a look at the different streams, what had the most engagement, which ones are getting us in front of our potential clients. And we actually ended up cutting quite a few channels, which to your point, saves you money on production, and saves you time on people that had to work on those channels. So I think it's a good thing for businesses to do. And I think civil engineering companies have a lot of areas where they can focus on this just because of new tools that have come into play in the engineering space with AI and other things that have streamlined, your workforce and some of your processes. So it's just, there's a lot of room for improvement there on that bottom line. And a lot of the stuff that I think Ben has shared with us today is going to help you to be able to do that. Now, Ben, before I let you go, I do want to ask you just kind of one kind of final question for those civil engineering leaders that are watching, that are really looking to, ramp up the profits, focus a little bit less on the top line, more on the bottom line. What would kind of final pieces of advice to kind of wrap us up for today that you can leave them with?
Yeah. Well, not to make too much of a hideous plug, but if you follow me on LinkedIn, Profit Dr. Ben Hansen, we do a fair amount of content, just like you were mentioning, Anthony. That's one of our primary content streams. We don't do it in too many places. And then, this podcast. What I wanted to touch on first is you mentioned a very important point, this idea of kind of organic growth or organic evolution. Like over a period of time, you've added one podcast and then another stream. So normal for businesses, particularly businesses that have been in business for a lot of years, to, organically grow and add things. And so what I'm suggesting is, there's a period of organic growth. And then you mentioned the word audit, pretty applicable kind of term to, have an intervention, let's say a profit intervention, and then trim back or prune the elements of things that have grown over that period of time that are no longer serving you. And again, just like, pruning in the garden, how do you get those, really, beautiful trees and roses and gardens and whatever? It tends to be pruning away the things that are kind of sickly and dead. And that sort of applies to that organic stuff. But what I would say is, just to recap, profit psychology, have an intervention around profitability. Number two, be very, very cautious if you find yourself in we need to take work in order to keep people busy, or to cut prices and take marginal work. Sometimes that can become like a big habit. And then as we were talking about this pruning, I think that 50-20 principle, which is to cut half of the worst 20% in the next 30 days. And, big candidates for that are terrible clients, terrible market segments, terrible types of projects or job categories. Staff is also a big one. And depending on how you do your work, maybe subcontractors. Because again, it's those worst performers, those squeaky wheels, that are often the bane of the existence of whoever in your company has to deal with them. And that sucks away the creative energy and joy and kind of the oomph that they have to push forward and do their best work and invest in the good stuff.
That's awesome. All right. So once again, he is the Profit Doctor, Ben Hansen. Ben, where is the best place for our listeners to find you, connect with you? Please let us know.
Yeah, I'd probably say www.profitdoctor.com, PROFITDOCTOR. So Profit Doctor spelled the regular way. If you're like, hey, I'm sick and tired of working this hard and working this long to have this kind of skinny net profit margin, you could schedule a time with me and we could have a talk about that. Or you can follow me on LinkedIn and, start perusing some of my content. Also, through both of those channels, we highlight a number of other presentations that we've done that are a little bit more like the profit prescription and the recipe on how to do things, rather than this, which is, I think, maybe a lot more fun, a lot more interactive, but a little bit less of a cookbook. Do this step, do that step, do the next step. We do have a Profit Accelerator program, which is that 90 days to 5 points of additional profitability. Hey, look me up and see if we can guarantee that we'll get you those 5 points or your money back.
That's awesome. Well, Ben, great information. I think a lot of this is super applicable to civil engineering organizations, and they definitely can. I know where they can make improvements because a lot of the people that come on the show have voiced some of those pain points. And I want to thank you for spending some time with us here on the Civil Engineering CEO to give us some of the knowledge that they can take and use.
Well, thanks, Anthony, for hosting this. It seems like you're doing great work and putting, the right CEO framed knowledge out there for other civil engineering CEOs and then probably key executives within their organizations.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben.
Okay. Be well and profit.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel here. We do put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.